I'm Ron Brookman, licensed structural engineer in California, and I received my master's degree in structural engineering from University of California at Davis in 1986. I've been practicing structural engineering ever since then, nearly 24 years now, and have designed and retrofitted numerous steel frame structures. My experience includes commercial, office buildings, manufacturing facilities, industrial buildings. About 3 years ago, I started examining the questions about the World Trade Center disaster and other questions pertaining to 9/11. And I heard Richard Gage's interview on a CD that someone handed to me, and I immediately went to the AE 9/11 Truth website and started reading and looking into the questions, and I've been reading and looking into questions ever since. Obviously, I have a professional interest in the World Trade Center disaster, whether it's the towers or Building 7 or any of the related events. And when I first looked at the films of Tower 7, I automatically assumed and concluded pretty quickly that it was a controlled demolition. I didn't think it was worth a lot of extra effort to dig into the various details of the building in order to refute that. So my first conclusion was that Building 7 was a controlled demolition, and why would anyone spend a whole lot of time and money to analyze the building to come to a different conclusion until that particular obvious conclusion was simply refuted, and it hasn't been at this point in my mind. The towers themselves are a little more complicated in that they were both hit by planes, and they had, I would say, larger, more consuming fires on the floors that were affected. So it's not as clear-cut a problem and solution as Building 7 is. But still, watching the towers come down in 10 to 15 seconds was a little bit alarming, to say the least. And seeing all of the debris that was shooting out for hundreds of feet in all directions was also a little bit alarming. And certainly the debris that shot out and hit Tower 7, 300 and some odd feet, and it's been clocked apparently at 70 miles an hour, leaving the 80th floor of the North Tower and making a fairly level trajectory for hit the top of Building 7, that to me is fairly alarming. And of course that was the reason that was given for the fires to have started in Building 7, was the debris impact. And I don't think that that's been completely proven. I don't feel that there's evidence of that's a foregone conclusion that the fires started because of the debris impact. I've been doing a significant amount of studying on Building 7 before I made any comments or real conclusions about the NIST reports. I wanted to read them cover to cover, and I do this with hard copy. I circled and made comments, went through them, spent a lot of time with questions and comments that I had about the reports. I compiled those into a 24-page or 26-page summary of my comments and questions, and that's what became the article that is now on the AE 9/11 Truth website. First of all, my main conclusion is that NIST never did a proper evaluation of the collapse site and the debris. And so they have never done any studies of the dust, for example, that came out of that. And they basically concluded that there was no evidence of explosives in the debris, even though they did not test for it. So that's a real bothersome thing. I would have hoped and expected that NIST would have tested for explosives in the World Trade Center debris as a whole because of the explosive nature of the entire event. And certainly the Twin Towers had an explosive nature when they collapsed. Everyone saw it. It's on videos. You can see that it is an explosive event. Whether the type of explosives or whether or not you would find explosive residue in the debris is something you have to test for. World Trade Center 7, I would have expected they would have tested for explosives also because of the nature of the collapse and the unprecedented nature of a steel-framed high-rise building collapsing in such a fashion. There is free fall, essentially, going from motionless to free fall instantly and free falling for 8 stories. So we know that happened. Okay, it's been measured and it's on videos. Everyone can see it. NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories. That's a bothersome part of the puzzle because NIST never explained it. And their only explanation was it was consistent with their collapse analysis. It wasn't consistent with the actual video documentation. There is no video documentation that I've seen that shows the buckling of columns on the north face. There are NIST simulation diagrams that show buckling of columns on the north face, but there is no video evidence of that. And so that's another bothersome part of it. The video, the lower part of the building was always obscured from view in any of the videos. So you could only see the top 30 stories maybe. I'm not quite sure. I think it was about the 18th floor that was where the building was obscured from view below that. Now NIST claims that the columns were buckling in the first several seconds before the free fall occurred. Now I don't see how that's possible because once buckling occurs there's motion, and the buckling can't occur without seeing some motion. Okay, you could see motion in the penthouse structures. The east penthouse went first. You could see that move. Okay, so there was something that had failed internal to the building before the external part of the building failed. You could see the west penthouse fail before the rest of the building started to move. So there were internal failures, and that's part of their explanation. I agree, there were internal failures, whether those were due to fire and thermal expansion, or whether those were due to explosives or some kind of pyrotechnic incendiary device. We don't know. I would say, in my opinion, that there is no precedent for that kind of an event to occur due to an office fire. And that's why it's a very, very unusual event. It was, and it needs to have more study. It needs to have more analysis, or not computer analysis perhaps, but it needs to have more study done on the parts that NIST either left out, ignored, or did improperly. The other part of their explanation that bothers me is the shear studs. And I've been trying to get information on the shear studs and the floor framing for over a year now from NIST. The shear studs are small steel bolts, essentially, that are welded to the top flange of the steel beams, and those are embedded in the concrete slab. so that that locks the concrete and the steel together. It creates a composite floor, which is much stronger than the concrete or the steel alone, or in combination without the shear studs. And the shear studs were used on all of the beams in the floor, but NIST claims that they were not used on many of the girders in the floor. And I find that somewhat unusual, in that most engineers, I would say, or if I were designing the building and using shear studs on a number of beams or most of the beams in the building, I would sure put them on the girders too, because it makes everything just that much more stable and more integrity to it, more structural integrity. I haven't been able to get any information on the shear studs from NIST, and it's been over a year since I requested information, and so it's been in appeal now in the Department of Commerce. The Freedom of Information Act allows us to write to NIST and request information, and I've done this on 3 occasions now. My first request was for information related to the collapse area, or the collapse initiation area on the 13th floor, and the shear studs. So I'm trying to study the local area where NIST, where they claim the collapse began. I want to see exactly if their explanation makes sense. And I've had a lot of trouble getting information. They claim that the information I'm looking for is not available. So that was the first FOIA request. The third FOIA request was for the calculations that proved the collapse initiation. And I didn't expect computer files. I just expected some calculations, maybe a couple of sheets, half a dozen pages, something where they came to the conclusion and proved that thermal expansion actually caused the collapse to begin. And they denied the request and said that, well, they sent me a disk with computer files on it, input files for the ANSYS analysis, which I didn't request, but they said that all of the remaining files and the output for the analysis was not available, and they were withholding that information because of concerns about public safety. And the NIST director has the right to withhold information if he discovers, or if he determines that it could jeopardize public safety. How would this jeopardize public safety? I'm looking at it from a public safety point of view. I would like to resolve this whole issue in my mind and in the mind of many people that don't agree with the NIST conclusions. I would like to see this whole thing resolved so that we can move on, and so that we can feel safe in our high-rise buildings. I don't feel that safe in our high-rise buildings sometimes when I know that things like this are going on. But I asked that question of NIST. How in the director's judgment would release of these calculations jeopardize public safety? Now, I never got a response on that question from the director of NIST. I did get a response on that question from the senior communications officer at NIST. And his response was that if these files were released, that this would provide groups of people with the ability to predict high-rise building collapses, and it could be considered a threat to public safety. I'm not kidding. That was what the most recent letter I've received from NIST said. And that implies that anybody who requests or demands these calculations is a threat to public safety. And I find that just totally unbelievable. It's implausible. It can't get any more ridiculous than that. There's one other point, and this doesn't really have to do with NIST or the NIST reports. Well, it has to do with the NIST reports, but it has to do with the building design profession and architects, engineers, and the public. And here we are in 2010, almost 9 years after this event occurred. There's still numerous unanswered questions. I happen to have a professional stake in this. I want to see these questions answered. I want to know that our buildings are safe, and I want to know that our people are safe. And it's time for people to start looking at this, because there's a real kind of cloud around issues with 9/11. I think it's time for people to open up and just realize that in order for to heal from this, we're going to have to just get realistic about it and talk about it, answer these questions in an open way. I've written to numerous engineers. I don't get a response. I've written to numerous Congress people. They won't respond. I've written to judges. They don't respond. I was just flabbergasted to get a response from NIST. And the response from NIST wasn't a response to a letter I wrote to NIST. The response from NIST came because I wrote to President Obama. And he asked the director of NIST to respond. And that's just, it's incredible to me that the director of NIST responded because of a letter I wrote to President Obama. The point is, my inquiry to President Obama was about the World Trade Center 7 NIST reports, the three in particular, the 1A, the 19, the 19A reports. And I pointed out that I felt these reports were just a monumental waste of time and money and a real slap in the face and a national disgrace. And apparently that, struck a chord in the White House somewhere, and he wanted the director of NIST to respond to that. So when I got a response from the director of NIST, he was talking about the Twin Towers. He wasn't even talking about World Trade Center 7. And so I took his clue, and I took his advice, and he said if I have further questions, I could contact the senior communications director at NIST, and so I did. And I've written him, and I've received a response from him too. And that was the response where he said that release of these files would jeopardize public safety again, or he explained why. He thought it would. The shear stud study goes on, and I have discovered another piece of information that may or may not shed some light on it, but there's a reference that I looked up that was written in 1986 by the project manager at Frankel Steel Limited, and I would assume that he knows what he's talking about when it comes to World Trade Center 7. He was the project manager on that building. And his short paper, which was presented to the Canadian structural engineers, indicates shear studs on the girders that NIST indicates there were no shear studs on, and that's what caused the initiation of collapse, or that had a large part in the initiation of collapse. So we have conflicting information here, and the conflicting information, I think, is worth following up on, and if NIST is not aware of that, I would be surprised, because they started their report with the FEMA 403 report on World Trade Center 7, and this particular document that I found was one of the references to FEMA 403. So that's an interesting little piece of the puzzle which has yet to be followed up on. I would think that the shop drawings would have information on them. The structural design drawings would have information on them. The specifications for the shear studs should have information that could resolve it. The question of the shear studs, the easiest way that it would have been to resolve that would be to examine the steel, except that the steel was picked up and carted away before anybody got a good look at it. And the destruction of evidence was a criminal act in itself. It would have answered a lot of questions that we can't answer because we don't have the structural steel to examine. It was already being carted away and destroyed when the FEMA investigators got there about a month after September 11th. It was being destroyed rapidly, quickly and rapidly. The National Construction Safety Team Act, which was passed by Congress in 2002, specifically requires NIST to determine the likely cause of collapse. And it also requires NIST to issue a public report that concludes, that proves their conclusion why they feel that was the likely cause of collapse. Now, in my mind, I haven't seen that they have, first of all, determined the most likely cause of collapse, and they certainly haven't, in their public reports, I haven't seen conclusive proof that they got the right cause of collapse, or that they got the cause of collapse correct. The NIST computer model, actually, they had done a bunch of finite element models of the connections, individual connections, so they had connections failing before the members failed. And the connections failed when the connections were actually 4-part connections. When 3 of the 4 parts failed, they considered it to be all failed. So they had a threshold of failure that was set so that 25% of the connection strength would not remain. If it reached 75% of its capacity or its strength, it would fail. And that, to me, seems a little contrived, a little bit nonsensical. Some of the results I found reading through the NIST reports was that they didn't correlate. They didn't match. The results they got from the 14-story model using LS-DYNA were different from the results they got from the 16-story model using ANSYS. And so some of the correlation wasn't there. That's what it appeared to me in reading their reports. They did a column 79 removal in the 14-story model to see what would happen. Well, as you would expect, all the floors above it collapsed. But the whole 14-story model didn't collapse because there were many other columns in the building. There were 24 columns in the interior and I think 58 on the perimeter. It's a lot of columns. You have one column fail, and there are many other columns that are going to remain standing. As a structural engineer, I don't believe that the failure of one column would normally bring down an entire building in the way we saw World Trade Center 7 come down, because of redundancy, because of all the other columns in the building that were not affected. And there were so many columns in the building that were not affected by either the fires or the impact damage, and they all came down just at once. So it's a little disheartening. It's implausible. I don't believe that NIST has proved their point as far as the complete collapse of the building due to the local failure that occurred, leading to column buckling of a single column, leading to multiple column buckling, leading to all the interior columns buckling and all the exterior columns buckling, and the whole building coming down at Freefall for 8 stories. Now once you get the building up above moving down for 8 stories, there's no way to save it. It's moving. You can't save it once it's going, once it's crashing down for 8 stories, you won't be able to save the rest of it. We need a new investigation of the entire event, or the series of events that occurred on 9/11. There are so many unanswered questions. It's not just the buildings. It's going to take a lot more people to demand an investigation before anybody's going to pay any attention. And that's why I think it's time for people to start. People want to put this behind them, I'm sure. They don't want to think about it, but it's really caused so much havoc in the whole world that I think it's to the benefit of people to just wake up and realize what's going on here, and try and get some justice, try and get some honest truth, some answers. It's a hard thing sometimes to go forward and really talk about this stuff, but it's important to, I feel.